All right, so today we're going to be going over the Maclan Link programming and data log. I've noticed a lot of people going over how to connect the Bluetooth module or how to update the ESC or other things like that, which is great, but nobody ever really goes over the programming or the data log with it. It's very important that you do have your ESC updated to the latest firmware for whatever your ESC is, whether it be the Pro 160, the 200, or Pico 100 or anything like that. You should always update it to the latest firmware. Do the first thing you do with the ESC. Once you have the ESC plugged in, you can go over here to the programming section. If you're doing a two-wheel car or a four-wheel car or any of the other options they have preloaded here, you can start out with one of those and then just tweak it from there. Most of them you can change to whatever you want, but they give you a pretty decent baseline. Um, they are a very race-oriented company, so they know pretty well what most people will be running in a two-wheel drive blinky buggy car anyway. Um, if you go right here, the first option is going to be the run mode of the ESC, race blinky, practice, and race open. Practice is just going to be, um, it's going to be exactly like race open with all the boost timing and turbo timing and all of that, but it's going to add reverse to your car. Um, I never really use it. I know a lot of people do use it just because they don't like having, in case there's no marshals out there, you don't want to get off the stand and go walk down there and get your own car if you can just back up if you're stuck on a wall or corner or anything like that. Most of the time, I have my cars in Blinky because I run 17.5 and 13.5 cars. So, uh, first option is Blinky. The SBC voltage, SPE stands for Switching Battery Voltage Eliminator. Basically, that's just how many volts you're sending to your receiver, your transponder, your servo is the big one. So if your servo can do 7.4 volts, it's going to add torque, it's going to add speed to your servo. I still keep mine at 6 because I don't like a super fast servo. I know a lot of people will spend a ton of money, $200, $300 on servos just to have them be stupid fast and overly quick. I turn my servos down on purpose. It makes the cars easier to drive, more tame, things like that. Forward power, you're pretty much always going to want to have this at 100. It's always easier to turn it down on your controller with your dual rate. The censored mode, you could put it in full censored is what I run it in most of the time. If you put it in smart sense, if your sensor wire goes out, your car will keep running. So if you are worried about sensor wires, or things like that going out, you can leave it in smart sense. And if your sensor wire goes out, it'll run it in non-censored mode. For motor rotation, you have normal and reverse. I wouldn't recommend reversing your channels on your controller. It's always better to reverse your motor rotation on here. It just makes everything happier. Um, Everything usually goes a lot smoother when you do it that way. Um, I don't recommend turning on quick boot. Quick boot doesn't wait for a signal from the transponder and receiver and all that to initiate and turn on the ESC. If you have quick boot off, it's going to wait till it gets a signal to turn it on so that it knows that your controller is binded and everything. You might have problems with the car trying to run away or things like that if your controller isn't on and you turn the car on. So I always just leave quick boot off. It adds like an extra second to the car turning on. It's not that big of a deal. Throttle PWM. PWM stands for pulse width modulation. It's basically just how many times a second your ESC is sending an update of the throttle position to your motor. So if you're running it at 1000, it's going to send 1000 updates to your motor every second. A lot of people say a lower PWM is going to make the motor and everything feel more aggressive and more snappy, but it's also going to have slightly less response time. Um, it's going to be a lot less smooth. So if you're racing on something like dirt or loose loamy surface, or like even some looser AstroTurf tracks, you're not going to want to have it super low, because if you grab a bunch of throttle, it's going to go straight from 0 to 100 because it's updating less often. Um, I run mine usually anywhere from 4 to 8. I usually run it on slightly lower on carpet surfaces or something super high grip. Sometimes even on clay indoor tracks that are super nice and blue groove, I'll have it lower at 4. I'm usually at like 6.4 or 5K though. Your throttle punch is basically it's limiting the amount of initial amps whenever you just grab a handful of throttle. Um, if you are just like sitting and your motor's at 0 RPM, your car's still, and you just grab a bunch of throttle, it's going to limit the amount of amps that can just get dumped straight into that motor. Um, it helps smooth the car out, make it less aggressive. It's very similar to throttle punch. You should be dialing both of these in. Um, throttle curve is just going to be either positive or negative. It goes in 10% increments. You can adjust that on your controller also, which I recommend doing. On here, it's just extra work. On a controller, you can take your controller and just change it like on the fly. Most controllers you can bind it to a button or things of that nature. Your deadband, you can either put it on narrow, middle, or wide. I usually run mine on middle. It feels just fine that way. I haven't had any issues. It's just the amount of percentage of throttle it takes before it recognizes that it's getting any throttle. So if you have it your deadband at like middle, let's say is 5% throttle or something like that before it initiates. Um, if you give it like 4% throttle, it's not going to give any signal to the motor to go, but it will recognize, the ESC will recognize that you're giving it 4% throttle. Your protection settings are relatively important. You should be running 5-minute practice times or whatever your qualifiers and mains are anyway with a timer. But if you don't want to and you want to have a battery like LiPo cutoff, I usually run mine at 6 volts because you're running 2S most of the time. Um, I just put mine at 6 volts. I've never heard a battery at 6 volts. I wouldn't recommend anything lower than that though. I always have my motor cut off, either left at 220, my ESC cut off at 220. I just leave all these the same. I dock this to down. It gives you like an extra minute of run time, but usually by then the battery is so dead it doesn't even matter, especially in stock classes. Your brake strength is going to be the exact same thing as your forward power over here. It's just the max amount of brake that you can give the car. I again recommend adjusting that on the controller with your dual rate. Your brake PWM is the exact same thing as the throttle PWM. It's the how many times the ESC sends an update to the motor of your throttle position, just only on the brake side instead of the throttle side. Running a higher PWM on your brake and your throttle will increase your ESC temp because it's having to send more pulses a second. So I would watch out for running like your throttle PWM at like 32K or anything like that. Uh, that's a bit high. You aren't going to notice how smooth the motor is that high anyway. Brake PWM is the exact same thing. Your brake curve is the exact same curve that is on the throttle side. You can adjust that up and down if you want. I again recommend adjusting that on a controller. Most controllers have an option for that. It's going to be under Expo. Drag brake is another thing to look at dialing in. If you have your drag brake at, let's say, 10%, when you're letting off that throttle and your trigger is in the completely neutral position, your car is going to be at 10% brake. Some guys like having drag brake going through the corners and they just have a little bit and they think it helps settle the car in a little bit. I like to run zero drag brake. I would rather just touch the throttle, touch the brake with my finger a little bit and control it on my own. Your initial brake, whenever you are touching the brake, let's say this is your throttle graph. Let's say that's your throttle curve, that's your brake curve. If you're on the throttle right here and then you're on the brake a little bit, it's following these lines. If your drag brake is at like 10%, your line's going to be right here when you're at neutral. But then whenever you touch the brake, it's going to jump back up here to like 1% and then follow that curve. So you're actually going to be touching the brake and it's going to take a way brake. You're always going to want to have your initial brake set at the exact same or higher than your drag brake. Um, if you were to set, if you were to say, let's run zero drag brake, so it's going to be right here in the center, no throttle, no brake when you're in the neutral, and then you run your initial brake at, let's say, 10%, your brake is actually going to start down here and then go out to 100%. So if you want it to just initially jump straight to 10%, you're going to want to set your initial brake to like 10% or like 20%. If you have it all the way up at 50, I find that whenever you're touching the brake, it kind of unsettles the car a little bit. It's just going initially straight from zero coasting all the way to 50%. I wouldn't recommend having this any higher than like 20% past whatever your drag brake is. Um, so like let's say you're running 10% drag brake, I wouldn't recommend going above 30% on your initial brake. Over here in the data logging section, you're going to hit load data and then load from ESC while your ESC is plugged in. It's going to bring up all these. It's going to make it really long because it updates like every 10th of a second. So if you're looking for just peak motor temps or something on here, I always just hit collapse. It's always going to be in red, whatever the hottest number it reached was. If you want, you can go over here to graph and you can see it all graphed out. I'll get rid of some of. You can get rid or add any of the data back by clicking on it. If you're just wanting to look at like let's say your motor temp and your ESC temp, a little overwhelming, you can get rid of these. You can look for the peaks in here. So like the highest will be here out near the end. And you can look right over here and it'll show you what the peak temperatures are when you're hovering over that part of the data log. If you want to see your motor RPM versus throttle position, you can see like right here, he was on the throttle, about 31% on the throttle, and the motor got up to about 1100 RPM. This is really good for helping dial in your gearing is what I mainly use it for, and checking my motor and ESC temps. If you're running for like a really long time and you need to just look at, let's say like a 1 minute lap or something, you just want to see how the battery voltage drop was doing under like high loads or something or a certain lap, you can click crop up here. You can click crop and then you can click, let's say from here to here, and it'll crop into that part of the data. You click return and it'll go back out to all of it. Up here is the sessions tab. It divides every time you turn the car off and on into different sessions. Um, if you just want to look at like the first time you went out, you can click on session 1. It'll just show that. You go to session 2, and that way it helps divide up when you turn the car off. If you're on all sessions right here, it's going to show every session back to back, and it'll divide them with these little lines right here, these dotted lines. This is also a really good tool for checking your battery voltage over a run. Some tracks I like to run a full size shorty pack. Some tracks I like to run an LCG. This helps me pick which battery I like to run at which track because some tracks are super wide open. They have super sweeping corners, and I like to run the full size packs there because they don't have as much voltage drop, and you need the power to help get through the races there. That pretty much goes over all of the Maclan Smart the that pretty much goes over all of the Maclan Smart Link programming and data log stuff you can do. I'll leave a link down in the description on where to download this stuff. Just make sure your ESC and all of that's updated before doing this. Again, you're just going to go over here to the firmware tab, select firmware while your ESC is plugged in. Mine is not, and you're going to click on the newest version, and then you're going to hit download down here. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.